Cybersecurity. So I thought I'd do the following. Ever since the Bangladesh bank fraud, now 2.5 years ago, we launched a comprehensive response to help the banks improve their security around the SWIFT terminal, around the SWIFT network endpoints. But part of that is information sharing, and through that information sharing, we have more or less been sitting on the front row when it comes to these banks being subject to cyber attacks, at least when it relates to us. So what I thought is sort of share 3 lessons around bank security that I've observed through these sitting on that front row and the way these guys operate. And it gives a bit of a view on the state of cyber in general, but through the lens of the security of our banks. Maybe the first one is we always think of cyber as this really techno-sophisticated thing from science fiction movies. With, think Stuxnet, very advanced APTs, very custom designed malware, able to circumvent everything, and you don't even know what's going on, etc. And there is some of that, often not in the form that you think it is, not in the form of Stuxnet, but for example, this one is a very good example of how these things actually happen. This is WannaCry, if you remember, last year. Where it was a ransomware attack that was widely spread. Here I think it's superimposed on a German railway sign. But essentially what it was taking malware that had been developed by the smartest people on the planet, i.e. the NSA. It had been leaked from the NSA and subsequently offered for sale on the darknet. A couple of guys managed to get a hold of it and launched the WannaCry attack. So you see a combination of very sophisticated malware being developed by governments, ending up in the wrong hands of not so sophisticated people. I think at the end of the day, they did not really make that much money on the attack. The attack was fairly clumsy, but it did manage to spread quite quickly using a backdoor that had been discovered and exploited. Weaponized, if you will, by the NSA. So there is some of that, and there are now on the darknet incredibly sophisticated tools available. But this, at the same time, if you look at how people actually get into most of the banks, it still is very basic spear phishing. And it's incredibly low tech. An interesting one to read, if you have the time, is the FBI made a comprehensive report on their investigation into the Lazarus group, which is the group that is believed to be behind the Bangladesh bank attack, but also behind the Sony attacks a year and a half earlier, as well as what's known as the Polish watering hole attack, whereby they compromised the website of a Polish regulator and thereby were able to compromise every visitor of that website. So that's why it's called a watering hole attack. If you read through that report of the FBI, almost all the bank penetration started with very simple spear phishing. And it's literally down to the level of somebody asking for a job at the bank and say, please find my resume in the attached zip file. And of course, the attached zip file contains malware to then penetrate the computer of whoever happens to open the email, move laterally over the network, find their way over the network until they get to higher value computers with administrator credentials, throw in a lot of patience to be able to observe patterns and etc. And you get a long way with just those basic techniques without having to resort to weaponized malware at all. So a lot of it is fairly basic, and therefore my first rule, and people still get in through that, so my first rule and my first lesson is you have to assume breach. You have to assume that sooner or later these guys are going to get into your network. The old paradigm of pure perimeter security, and they will not penetrate our systems. I think if you're still living in that one, you should reconsider. You have to move to what's known assume breach and then in-depth defense. Because if they can get in most of the cases with these very elemental tools, that means that even if you beef up your defenses, you have to assume that reasonably sophisticated bad guys will get in. And that moves you then to another paradigm, which means you have to take an in-depth defense approach and look at not just prevent, but also detect, respond and recover, the basic mantra of cyber, those 4 stages. And that has to be risk-based, absolutely has to be risk-based. That would be my second observation. Any defense that I've seen working has to take into account things like what are the big prizes, what are the crown jewels, which personnel functions are more at risk, where do I need to put the defenses. All of that is not new. I mean, if I go back to a medieval village, I think here too you can see in-depth defense and risk-based defense at work. There's an outer moat with a wall, and then there's an inner castle, a citadel or whatever, as you can see, where the crown jewels are kept. It's not new to banking either, right? That's why we have vaults. Yes, you can penetrate the branch network, but you still have the actual valuables in a more secure area. So again, banks. The good news is that most banks are used to think about this in a risk-based way. They have always thought about high-value assets, low-value assets, protecting the high-value assets, looking at their personnel and distinguishing people with high authority from low authority, having different vetting programs, having procedures and controls in place. So none of this is new, but the real challenge is to now apply that way of thinking to in-depth cyber defense. Really make it risk-based and apply that, perform your analysis, perform your scenarios, and make it based on that. And you'll easily come across all the basic tools of the trade, like people measures, people training, controls, detection, all of that stuff that works in the old world, and you now have to apply to the new world. And I would say the third big lesson that we've learned is, at the end of the day, payments is an ecosystem. It's a network business. So you have to look at it across the chain. And when we launched our customer security program, we did that. We took into account the asset-based, the risk-based approach. So a lot of what the customer security program does is give the customers a set of controls that help to wall the SWIFT environment, if you will, but also train people, have controls in place, have a detection program, etc. So you'll see a lot of these controls taking into account that risk management. But the overall program really relies on cooperation across the chain. And I would say that one of the biggest changes now is that if we detect one of these breaches, or one of our customers detect the breaches, we immediately contact or help the bank contact their counterparties. We move down the chain, and in most of the cases, the counterparty banks are able to recover the money before it is paid out to the bad guys. And that whole chain, fast response, going down the chain, making sure that the mule accounts, of which my previous speaker was just speaking, the mule accounts do not pay out the money, and there's time to recover it from the intermediate bank. That really relies on good cooperation. It relies on planning. It relies on people having each other's contacts. It relies on information sharing. It relies on the frameworks around it. There's a whole slew of things that you need to take into account that ecosystem chain approach. But if it works, it really does. And I would say that one of the reasons we at least have not seen headlines like we saw 2.5 years ago with 80 million being stolen at the end of the day, I think one of the reasons that we have not yet seen a repeat of that headline is this industry cooperation and these recovery efforts whereby the banks prevent that money. If people manage to get their way all the way to the SWIFT terminal and enter fraudulent payments, at least the industry managed to prevent that money from being paid out or reach the final destination. So those efforts, together with the controls, so far, I would declare at least a success in the sense that we have not seen a repeat. Now, in cyber, you never know. There is no guarantees for the future. The threat keeps getting more sophisticated, and we'll all see what's going to happen tomorrow. But so far, so good. And with that, I would indeed say there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that these type of programs can indeed yield results. And if you take these three lessons into account, assume breach, take a risk-based approach, and look across the ecosystem, you can make